So welcome back. We are ready for our conversation, our third conversation, as we take a look at just 3 of the calls from Lambeth out of the, I can't remember, I think there were 8, 9, maybe even 10 calls that we dealt with. So we're going to look at the Lambeth Call. I just thought y'all might want to see the documents that we studied and worked with and did all this, and those are available. We put those links out ahead of time. But just to remember the context that this call for reconciliation comes from really comes, again, deeply rooted in Scripture. As we read in 1 Peter, in Jesus Christ, God reaches out to an estranged and fractured humanity. God becomes flesh, embodying and reconciling with humanity in an extraordinary, unique way. We come to God through Christ as living stones, formed in God's image in unique ways in different contexts. God binds us into a new nation, God's own people, inviting us into covenantal partnerships with God's mission of reconciliation. All that's gleaned from a deep read of 1 Peter. So, Canon Robertson, Chuck, I want to start with you at Lambeth. We kind of got off to a rocky start on the reconciliation document because we all kind of did a big gulp and pause when we got to one section that referenced Lambeth 98, specifically a resolution 1.10. So did Lambeth actually decouple, or was there, did we fall apart? What there was like minor and big reconciliation work going as we were doing minor and big reconciliation work. So what is your take from the work on reconciliation that we not only read about, but maybe we manifested?
Absolutely. Well, I found myself, like many, frustrated in essence, we got lost in the woods and we started meandering once again on something that we've been wrestling with for a long time now. And yet what I realize is when we finally made our way through that meandering, and maybe, just maybe, that was part of the process. It's certainly not an intentional part, but it took the time. But yet when we came to the end, we realized, especially through the Archbishop Canterbury's words about human dignity, which I believe you all will be talking about later, we realized that there really is a diversity of opinion. There really are different ways of seeing the issues of human sexuality, marriage, and relationships, and that is simply the reality, and that we come to those with prayer, theological reflection, come to different places. Lifting up Lambeth 110 out of 98 is fascinating to me because whether you're for it or against it, it's fascinating because from the beginning, Archbishop Longley, who called the very first Lambeth Conference back in 1867, was very clear that this was not meant to be a time to define doctrine or discipline for the individual autonomous churches that make up this communion. And his successor, Archbishop Tate, whom I quoted earlier, said the same thing. And that has continued on. I think a highlight moment was in 1978 when we were facing the issue of the ordination of women. Believe it or not, that was a huge issue. Thankfully, we're at a much different place now in the communion. But part of it was because the bishops gathered together in Lambeth said, yes, there are different minds on this. But in resolution 21.7, they said our holding together of diversity within a unity of faith and worship is part of the Anglican heritage. So to me, our meandering at this conference brought us to a place where we could finally say, here's where things are. Now let's get on and talk about crucial issues of climate, crucial issues of racial reconciliation, crucial issues of trying to share the love of God through Jesus throughout the world. This gives us a chance to move forward now. And so for that, we actually saw reconciliation, as it were, at work, even though it may have felt frustrating going through that process.
Bishop Sam, one of the things that struck me, because that initially human sexuality took up so much oxygen in the room, that I felt, but glad we got to, but I'm not sure got out to the rest of the world. This document says a great deal, and I felt there was a great deal of unanimity about condemning violence against based on gender. There was a great deal of of work that's being done and being suggested needs to still be done around ending criminal gender violence against people because of their gender or their sexual preference. That is denounced in this document. And there were examples from around the communion. And so I'm interested, Bishop Sam, what is it that you would lift up from that document that you feel like the press just completely ignored in terms of the ways that we saw some people come in?
Sure, thanks. Yeah, I think you're pointing to something that was true at a number of junctures during the Lambeth Conference in terms of what was reported by the press versus what actually happened. I'm going to digress for a half second just to tell a story early on. The first call document that we discussed was the one that was our first in this series of clergy conference on discipleship. And because there wasn't, we started with a voting process, which eventually, I think after that, got set aside. But because there wasn't unanimity in the vote around the discipleship document, in part because people were actually fully engaged and had some really helpful comments, edits, and critiques about the document. Some people said it's not in the form that I'm ready to vote for this, and it got reported in the secular press that that the Lambeth Conference and the Anglican Communion was not of one mind about discipleship and its importance. Well, that's not happened. So thankfully, we learned from that experience. We set aside the voting, and we did take the time to actually, in small group table discussions, as part of our process, look at the documents and give feedback to the teams that authored the documents so that they could be revised and improved based on the feedback. So that was all in the mix. And also, to Chuck's point, an example of living into what reconciliation can look like. If you take the proper steps and you do the work, you actually have conversation that builds out a common understanding. Even where there's disagreement, you can find the places where there's resonance. And there was great resonance in this document, as you point out, Bishop Ann, around common areas of injustice that the Anglican Communion is prepared to speak with one voice and to condemn, including injustice towards women, human trafficking. Another is very much a part of the ongoing conversation here in the Episcopal Church, but also in the wider Anglican Communion, is around, and you can imagine, especially in the Anglican Communion, the importance of denouncing the sort of legacy of colonialism and imperialism. And that's also a part of the fabric of the document around reconciliation. And it really challenged the way that we went about mission and the way that we misunderstood the fact that, as again, Chuck alluded to in an earlier story, when you arrive in a new place, God is already present, the Holy Spirit is already moving, and Jesus is already being experienced by the people there locally. And that is the touchstone for the way that we understand mission in the 21st century, as rooted in accompaniment, not in bringing someone something they don't already have, but in meeting together and appreciating the ways that the Spirit of God is already animating, informing, and deepening the discipleship locally. And that's a whole different dynamic, but it's very much a part of what it means if we take seriously the overall theme of the Lambeth Conference, God's church for God's world. If we're about partnering and walking together in God's world as a witness to what it means to be church, it's going to be much more powerful and much more resonant with the call, the biblical call to reconciliation. We've got a lot of work to do to get there. We all know that. We spent a lot of time at General Convention around the work with respect to truth-telling, reckoning, and healing, and our history around race in this country. That is part and parcel of that larger conversation and related to colonialism and imperialism. And this document was a place where we could find common ground across the communion around the importance of addressing the justice concerns that are at the heart of what it means to bring about reconciliation.
And Bishop Sam, I'm so glad you brought up the point that you can't have reconciliation without the truth telling. And what this document really, as building upon what you're saying, the truth telling that needs to happen in South Sudan is going to be very interesting. It has not only the colonial implications, but the truth telling among some internecine differences among different communities just within Sudan. So everybody's going to have hard work to do, kind of layered on hard work to do. And so I think that will start making us like we all live in a glass house. Each province is in some kind of glass house where some truth has to be told. And what it's going to take to but for the Anglican communion in particular, and I think now with the death of the Queen, what does decolonizing look like? Well, in Jamaica, it may look one way. In Australia, it may look one way. Fascinating that the country that cares least about having any songs about let me put it this way. We're not in the Commonwealth, but you would have thought in this country that was our queen. So, like the whole layers of what it means to be Anglican inside of a colonial story is going to be fascinating, truth-telling work to do. And I think keeping in North Carolina, realizing we've got our own level of work to do on that. Within the Episcopal Church, we have our work to do on that. And then how, Chuck, I'm going to give you the last word. How do we walk when we live in such glass houses as provinces? How do we walk well with the work being done in other parts of the communion on reconciliation?
1968, the Lambeth Conference meeting then, the bishops said in a resolution, I believe it was number 16, they said flat out racism, and we could add other isms to that. They said racism is a blatant denial of the Christian faith. You can't, how can we love God, as James says? How can we love in the book of James? How can we love God whom we do not see if we do not love our siblings whom we do see? But it went on to say something that I thought was really significant, and I think is a way forward for us as we move forward. It said, it spoke of the reconciling work of Jesus Christ, through whose love all human diversities lose their divisive significance. See, when we find the love of God and when we take that seriously and actually start doing intentional love, then what we find is we celebrate the diversities that matter, and we lose the diversities, we lose the sense of the divisiveness of those that just keep dividing us. As Bishop Michael often says, this isn't just pie in the sky. This is necessary work if we want to move forward as a human family.
Exactly. Bishop Sam, I didn't know if you had something you wanted to add, because you have had such a strong hand in shaping the work that the Episcopal Church is going to do next on truth, reckoning, and healing.
Nothing really to add at this point. I know we'll get into that in our later conversations together, but I'm so grateful to you, to Chuck, for this conversation, for opening up pieces of what we experienced there and trying to share that with our clergy in the Diocese of North Carolina. It really is true that the vision for this conference is that it's not just for bishops, it is for the whole church. And that by moving into this third phase and taking back the stories of what we talked about, what we saw, what we learned, and how we had the chance to really worship and fellowship with each other, what does that mean for the call to reconciliation, the call to justice? And as you said so eloquently, Bishop Ann, context. We each have work to do in our own context that's different, but together it resonates in that building of reconciliation. So just grateful for this conversation and grateful for the two of you in sharing not only this conversation, but the time together at Lambeth as part of that gathering.
Final thank you to you, Chuck, because you are in so many ways the face, along with Bishop Curry and others on the presiding bishop staff. You all are our emissaries from the Episcopal Church to help build and strengthen these global partnerships. Lambeth has good things to contribute to that, but the work that you and your staff do day in, day out, week in, week out, I think is really the necessary daily bread of keeping our Anglican communion with strong bonds of affection that are capable of stretching us in new ways. So thank you, Chuck, for being with us.
It's a gift to be with the Diocese of North Carolina, whether it's in person or like this via Zoom. I wish all of you the very best. God's blessings. And thank you for letting me be a part of this time.
Thank you so much.
Chuck.